I graduated from Oklahoma City University on May 29, 1936 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. My postgraduate plan was to get on active duty as an officer in the Army. Hitler was making this option easier, and I had Mother's brother, Major George Hatton Weems, a West Point graduate, known as Uncle Major, stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to keep me advised. In June of 1936, I went on active duty with the 9th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division. At Fort Sam Houston for 1 year, arranged by Uncle Major. It was an exercise under Congress's Thomason Act to select 1,000 of the best Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, students to serve for a year in the regular Army with the top 10% offered regular commissions at the end of the year. I learned a lot during the exercise. 4-year college ROTC graduates came with more training than I picked up in 1 year of ROTC, and a second year playing the cymbals in the military band for ROTC credit, at the University of Tennessee, UT, in Knoxville, plus 2 months of Citizens Military Training Camp, CMTC, in the summers. Because I was a leader in the last CMTC, I had been commissioned a second lieutenant in the Infantry Army Reserve in November 1935. At Fort Sam, I experienced an almost McCarthy-like inquiry. The country was terrified of communism, and college graduates had spent time in academia where everyone thought communists thrived. I went before a regular Army officer candidate board, and one of the board members happened to have been an instructor at the ROTC program at the UT during my freshman and sophomore years there. He asked, "Lieutenant Slayden, what part did you play in the communist movement at UT in 1932? I couldn't give him an intelligent answer because I didn't know there was a communist movement at UT. I had been a cartoonist for the Mugwump, the UT magazine, and at least one of my cartoons had poked fun at 2-year compulsory ROTC. Did that qualify me as part of the communist movement? I didn't hear anything more on the subject, but I left the evaluation board with the sure knowledge that I'd never make the cut. Randolph Airfield was close by, and several lieutenants took the physical exam for Army Air Corps flying training there. So, I took the exam too. To pass the infantry exam, I had received a waiver because my right foot is flat. The Army Air Corps noticed that, but, so what? Pilots fight sitting down. I breezed through everything else and was ordered to report to Randolph Field for pilot training in June 1937, a week or two after my exercise at Fort Sam. The job started as soon as I could get there and paid $100 a month. That was a lot more than a cadet flyer's $21 per month but $30 less than a lieutenant made. Regardless, I expected a raise the second year after the Cloverleafs saw my pitching. I summered in Selma as the junior member in a pitching staff of 6. I won 5, lost 5, got in a few good helps and pitched for a lot of batting practices. At the end of the season, the Cloverleafs wanted me to report for the next spring training. But by then, I'd learned a valuable lesson. Someone with a college degree is wasting time staying on a team where 2 high school dropouts are better, probably always will be better, at pitching than he is. Besides, our monthly $100 was only paid for the months we played. Army Air Corps Cadet, Class of 1938C. In the waning summer of 1937, I wrote the Air Corps that I had missed the June class for flying training due to my unspecified mishandling of the notice the Air Corps sent me. With luck, the Air Corps replied, "Come in October." I had just enough time to go from Selma for a visit at my hometown, Waverly, a small, population 1,152, rural town in Tennessee, before reporting to Randolph Airfield in Texas. I became a flying cadet in a company, J Flight, Primary Flying School, Randolph Field in October 1937. After 17 years of boring classrooms, I found a curriculum I loved because it taught me what I needed to know to fly. Navigation, communications, weather and airplane mechanic classes, I sailed through them, but not meteorology. It was the hardest class in primary flying school. 90% of the cadets failed the class, washing many of them out of school and bringing cadets with otherwise good academic records to the brink of washing out with just one more misstep. I worked hard on meteorology because I knew I wouldn't be half worth shootin' if I failed the MET test. To my relief, I passed with a grade of 79. I also had to push to reach 35 letters per minute in Morse code on the diddah machine and then never used it again. At first, I was a dodo. Dodos are the pawns of upperclassmen, but only for 3 months. Then dodos became upperclassmen. I was a duck in water. God made me to fly, with one exception, my stomach. With the help of a Sigma Nu fraternity brother flying instructor, who was supposed to wash me out of the training for air sickness and didn't, and an elbow-length, liquid-proof pair of leather flying gloves, that one could fill instead of the airplane, I got over my air sickness and graduated from flying school. Cadets are supposed to turn in their flying gloves after training. I tried, but the supply sergeant wouldn't accept them. They cost me $4.50, the price of a fun-filled weekend in San Antonio. The first airplane I flew in training was the PT-3, Pursuit Trainer. The next was a P-12, a pursuit plane, flown in advanced training. Both were bi-wing, kite-type airplanes without brakes. They landed slowly enough that brakes would be unnecessary extra weight. For proper parking, airmen rushed out, grabbed the wing tips and pushed the planes into position. Those airplanes were the dinosaurs of the day, although the P-12 was a box office attraction, shooting poor old King Kong off the Empire State Building. Our textbook on airplanes advised that retractable landing gears added 23% more weight to the planes and would not be continued on others. On July 10, 1938, I had my first plane crash. As part of the 61st Flying School Squadron in the Advanced Flying School at Kelly Field, Texas, near Randolph Field, I dropped a wing while landing a P-12E and tore the tip of the wing off. It wasn't very serious or even dangerous, but I took a lot of heckling from a buddy who had flown into a fence while landing a couple of weeks earlier. He was paying me back for heckling him. Toward the end of the course, we had a cross-country flight from Kelly Field to Muskogee, Oklahoma, and back, a 1,000-mile trip, the longest to date. That was a heavy day's work in our little airships. We had good up-to-date maps of Texas showing the airways marked for night flying. They were made by Rand McNally, and each student pilot bought his for 25 cents. On October 5, 1938, Cadet 6265878, graduated from the U.S. Army's primary and advanced flying schools, specializing in pursuit aviation, at Kelly Airfield as a second lieutenant, again, this rank in the Army Air Corps Reserve. See Annex 3 for the Graduates in Pursuit Aviation, a company, Advanced Flying School, Class of 1938C, on page 101. Langley Field and Andy Gump. My first assignment was at Langley Field in Virginia as a fledgling pilot in the 36th Squadron, 8th Pursuit Group. We were armed with aircraft from P-12s to P-30s. Most of our airplanes were P-30s, called PB-2s. The PB-2 was the only two-seater, single-engine fighter plane to see service. Some misguided aircraft designer added a second seat facing the rear of the PB-2 for an enlisted gunner to defend the airplane's rear while in flight. Just looking at that rear-facing seat made my stomach quiver. Langley didn't have a gunnery range for fighter rear seat training, so no enlisted man ever rode on my training flights. The PB-2 was an early version of an airplane with retractable landing gears. A large hand crank dominated the right side of the cockpit. You wanted wheels up? You cranked them up 49 turns. You wanted wheels down? You pressed a button and down they came, loudly, gravity taking control. The handles never moved when the wheels came down, but pilots always leaned to the other side of the cockpit, just in case. Retractable landing gears complicated the art of flying. Little more than a year later, my wheels-up crash landing taught me the truth of the saying, flying by the seat of your pants. Then the checklist was born. An inspired crew chief spun off of the funny paper strip Andy Gump and came up with the Gump checklist. Gump was the acronym for gas, on the correct tank, undercarriage, in the correct position, mixture, of fuel for the job at hand, and propeller, set to the correct pitch. That and walking around the plane kicking the tires with a damn good crew chief made the system work. Shortly before I retired in 1962, I used a half-hour-long checklist before piloting my first jet-age airplane. At that point, I had been flying a desk for many years. That checklist never gave me the secure feeling Andy Gump did. My PB-2 crew chief should have received a medal. The 8th Pursuit Group at Langley was a gung-ho outfit commanded by Colonel William E. Kepner. In those days, the Army, and its Air Corps, required young officers, especially new second lieutenants, to call upon their commanding officers, COs, and ladies with time specified for the couples to receive such calls. Young airplane jockeys fresh out of flight school in 1938 came with hats that stood up stiff, Sam Browne belts, swords, boots, spurs were optional on the ground. And lots of calling cards to leave at the appropriate places in the appropriate numbers when making formal calls on commanders. As one could imagine, a second lieutenant calling on a colonel commanding at the group level was stressful. Sunday afternoon was an appointed time for such stylized social visits. The rules were that if you called on the commander and no one was at home, then you could push your cards through the mail slot on the front door and receive credit for the call. One Saturday night in the officers' club bar with several flying school classmates, the subject arose that several of us were in arrears for calls on the colonel. It also was discussed that Colonel and Mrs. Kepner were to be out of town the entire weekend, including Sunday afternoon. Because I was unbelievably naive, my peers loaded me down with stacks of cards, 3 from each lieutenant, to be delivered for credit through the front door of the colonel's quarters the next afternoon. The time came. I knocked on the door, for the neighbors' sake. I waited, also for the neighbors. I then started shoving handfuls of cards through the mail drop in the colonel's front door, when it opened. Although my mind began to go blank, I do remember my eyes traveled from the colonel's feet to his face as his eyes moved back and forth from my face to the bunch of cards in my hands. I could see the meaning of the situation compute in his eyes. Then, with a broad smile, he asked, "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" It's hard to remember my response or the details of the conversation that ensued, but there's no doubt about the value of honest confession, especially when the colonel catches you red-handed. I do remember he had me in for a drink. I'd called upon the colonel and his lady for an excruciating 30 minutes. Colonel Kepner had a sense of humor and, while I was at Langley, he never let me forget the incident, especially that I knocked first. Many years later as a lieutenant colonel, I was going through a receiving line at a formal function in which I was to shake hands with then Lieutenant General Kepner, the commander of the United States Air Force, USAF, Alaska. He also had been the CO of the 8 Fighter Command in Europe during the war. As I stood in line, I thought, surely, he won't remember that day I called upon him and Mrs. Kepner, surely not. By that time, I had considerably more rank and less hair. As it came time to shake his hand, I smiled while his aide-de-camp announced my name. General Kepner hesitated, holding my hand in mid-shake as he stared at my face. Then he burst forth in an enthusiastic smile, pumped my hand, and said, "Lieutenant Slayden." Flying the PB-2 at Langley had its limitations. Our flights were mostly below 10,000 feet until oxygen was installed. Then above 12,000 feet, pilots bit on the end of a rubber hose, blow-drying our tonsils. That and no heat in the cockpit made flying at high altitudes rare. The first year I took off with a loaded gun was 1939, 2 years after I started flying. Second lieutenant for the third, and last, time. After a few months at Langley, the PB-2s disappeared, and we were equipped with brand new P-46 Hawks, real joy buggies. We could fly up to 20,000 feet. But the Air Corps was running out of money, so we could only fly 4 hours per month for most of the same year the war in Europe started. As it turned out, I put that extra time to good use. The war scare had grown, and so had the Air Corps. Competition for regular Army slots was fierce. Several hundred Army Reserve lieutenants, such as myself, were to be given an exam with only the top 100 or so getting regular Army commissions. The 8th Group went all out to help its junior birdmen get ready for the exam, and that worked for me. I had plenty of time to study and a set of bachelor quarters in Dodd Hall to myself. Most unfortunately, my roommate from Arkansas, Elton Earl, Gabby, Holcomb, who was a friend and classmate from advanced flying school, had been lost over the Atlantic a few weeks earlier. I papered my quarters with posters of information I needed to know to pass the test. Literally all over the walls, ceilings, and some of the floor. Navigation was in the bedroom, mechanics in the living room, communications in the kitchen, and weather in the bathroom. I read them morning, noon, and night. I read the books to the walls and the walls to the books. When it came time for me to take the exam, I could shut my eyes and read the answers to questions off the appropriate posters in my quarters. I could find enough of the answers papered on my quarters to come out ranked 7th of 80 lieutenants taking the exam at Langley Field. On August 15, 1939, I was commissioned a second lieutenant for the third and last time, this time in the regular Army with a career in the making. I never stopped using the posters on the wall technique. Those posters changed abstract thoughts into ideas and allowed me to visualize them by making them a part of my concrete environment. I established posters, or visual environments, to be the retainers for difficult memory work. I carried 52 empty, numbered environments around in my head. For example, my 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, and so on. I got good enough at visualizing whatever I had to remember in or around the bun, shoe, tree, etc., that I could hear a list of 52 things, including numbers or abstract concepts, read in sequence in a short time and immediately recite them back accurately. By the way, 52 as the number of my mental environments wasn't random, it's the number of cards in a deck. I played pretty good poker in my time, including across Europe in World War II. I sent my military pay stateside to my wife, and most of my poker winnings. I also could do fantastic card tricks. Sometime later, when I was a lieutenant colonel stationed at the Pentagon after the war, I earned quite a reputation for my visual environments. It was during another period in which I had time on my hands. In those days, there was so much combat experienced rank at the Pentagon that lieutenant colonels emptied ashtrays. I became bored, expanded my memory system to several hundred visual environments and memorized the Pentagon telephone directory. Now, that is to say, I put A to AB in my bun, page 1, AC to AD in my shoe, and so on until I went through the alphabetical listing of people's telephone numbers. By the listing of letters on each page, I got good enough to tell about where someone's name would fall in which column. That George Morrison was in the left column toward the bottom of page 44. Before too long, people with Pentagon phone directories in hand randomly walked into my office and, with no preamble or how do you do, asked me where in the directory they could find, for example, Robert Smerdlap's telephone number. I'd tell them. They'd stare at me, test me again, stare at me, and then leave, talking amongst themselves. I'm certain money changed hands after many of those encounters. There were several gentlemen who visited my office routinely, each with a new sucker in tow. I never told anyone there how I did it. While stationed at Langley, one flight was of particular interest. I flew the rear ranks of a PB-2 flight up Pennsylvania Avenue in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second inaugural parade.